If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel, as well as follow me and subscribe to me on all my other social media platforms. What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back with another discography ranking. It's been about a month since I did the immolation ranking, and now here we are with yet another ranking, and this time, probably one of the biggest ones that I've done by far here on this channel, as we are about to rank all 17 studio albums from one of the greatest bands in the history of music, the one and only Iron Maiden. So yeah, this has been a highly anticipated one for not only myself, but probably for others who have been fans of this channel and of the discography rankings I've done. And yeah, it's crazy it took this long to get to Maiden, but here we are. Now, as far as how I got into Iron Maiden, well, this kind of goes back... excuse me. Kind of goes back to whenever I was first diving into more metal. Like, I was already, by the mid-2000s, I was already into Metallica and Avenged Sevenfold, and was slowly kind of working my way through bands. And then I come across Iron Maiden through VH1 Classic, and instantly hooked. And they became an instant favorite of mine pretty much ever since I was a little kid in elementary school heading into junior high. So yeah, Iron Maiden, one of the biggest influences on me in terms of a music lover, and without Iron Maiden, who the hell knows where heavy metal would be today. So all respect and love to the great Maiden. But without further ado, let's get into the history of Iron Maiden. So, Iron Maiden formed in 1976, I believe, out of London, England, and, of course, the main original member is Steve Harris on bass. Early on, few different people coming into the band before Dave Murray comes in on guitars, and then after even more different people come in, we settle on the early lineup of Steve Harris on bass, Dave Murray and Dennis Stratton on guitars, Clive Burr on drums, and Paul Di'Anno on vocals. Now, of course, they are often seen as one of the pioneers of the new wave of British heavy metal that was starting to become red hot towards the end of the 70s. And yeah, this was also during the same time the whole punk movement was going on in England, and then punk went mainstream, which left the underground wide open for heavy metal to make a comeback, considering, by that point in the late 70s, in both England and even in America, it was like punk, at least in England, and then here in America, disco had kind of taken sway in terms of, like, popular music. But then over in England, you was hearing all these bands coming up, like Iron Maiden, Motorhead, Saxon, kind of coming up out of the underground and creating something very unique. Like, it took the influence of early heavy metal, of Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Deep Purple, and Led Zeppelin, mixing it with a little bit of that prog rock of groups like Genesis, yes, King Crimson, and even Jethro Tull, and even kind of mixing it a little bit with the speed of punk. So in terms of the British bands, Sex Pistols and The Clash. So basically, new wave of British heavy metal was mixing all that together, even though Steve Harris will say to this day he was not inspired by punk. But, agree to disagree, but you were inspired by punk just a little bit. Just a little bit. Di'Anno, he's practically a punk vocalist in a metal band. So yeah, hate to disagree with a legend, but yeah, Harris, agreed to disagree, but you're wrong. So yeah, Maiden was seen as like the leaders of that entire movement, and like even created their own independent record label called Rock Hard Records, which was a total ripoff of Stiff Records, which was an independent label for the punk scene. After all, the old slogan was, if it ain't stiff, it ain't worth the fuck. So they go, if it ain't rock hard, then it ain't worth a fuck. So yeah, they definitely took some stuff from punk. Just gonna keep saying that. But as they would play local clubs and local venues in the British scene, then they get signed to EMI Records after they did some early demos, and would eventually go into the studio, and in 1980 we get the debut album, Iron Maiden. This is my number 10 album overall. This is a really good foundation for Iron Maiden. Granted, production not the best, but then again, the producer that they had, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he honestly didn't really give two flying fucks. So because he didn't care, the rest of the band was trying to get rid of him and try different producers, but they did a far worse job, so they were like, okay, we'll stick with the guy who doesn't care. Just have to salvage what is here and make the best of a meh situation. But still, the songs were absolutely great. Phantom of the Opera, Transylvania, their first big instrumental. Remember Tomorrow is still a classic song to this day. Charlotte the Harlot. And even Runnin' Free is a pretty catchy tune. And the song Iron Maiden, you can kind of look at the song Iron Maiden as kind of a proto-thrash metal song because of the speed that that song has. But yeah, raw production, kind of humble beginnings, but still really good foundation for what Maiden is about to pull off going forward. But yeah, the self-titled, my number 10. So again, more playing in the local scene. Dennis Stratton would end up leaving the band because he had some disagreements with everybody. He wanted the band to become more polished, while everybody else was just wanting to do what they've been doing, but maybe improve the production just a little bit, but not go completely over the top. So he leaves, and then in walks Adrian Smith on second guitars, thus starting arguably the greatest guitar duo of all time with Dave Murray and Adrian Smith. Two completely different styles that work very well together. So they would return to the studio, and this time they would tap legendary producer Martin Birch, who had up to this point already worked with Black Sabbath. He also worked with Rainbow and Blue Oyster Cult. So he already has a great production foundation for himself, and he would become the main guy for Maiden all the way up until Fear of the Dark, 11 years later. But they would work together with Martin Birch, and then released in 1981, we get Killers. This is my number 4 album. You want to talk about probably the biggest quantum leap in terms of production and songwriting. This is it. Massive upgrade. I think with the addition of Adrian Smith on second guitars, that cannot be understated or even overstated. And then, of course, Martin Birch coming in and doing a fantastic job with the production and the mix. Starting off right away with Ides of March into Wrathchild. You got Murders in the Rue Morgue. I believe that's what it's called. To the track listing I go. Murders in the Rue Morgue. Okay, I was correct. I was just making sure I didn't flip words around. The song Killers is fantastic. Purgatory, Prodigal Son, Genghis Khan. Top to bottom, like I said. When it comes down to the songwriting, little more melody, little more heavy, but of course with the production, it really enhanced everything that this album was able to showcase. And like I said, right out of the gate, Murray and Adrian just kill it on the dual leads and the harmonies and riff writing. Like, holy shit. Fantastic. One of the greatest sophomore albums in the history of heavy metal. And like I said, it's that leap going from the self-titled to Killers in just a year. Little over a year, in fact. And massive improvements on all fronts. So yeah, Killers. my number 4. So they would now actually begin to tour elsewhere, even doing some North American dates. I believe they opened for Judas Priest on this album, if I'm not mistaken. So, pretty big honor, I would say, for Maiden to open for one of the gods of metal in Judas Priest. And while they were touring, most of the band kind of realized, if we want to get to that next level, we need a new vocalist who can go up into those high-range vocals. So they were already thinking about getting rid of Deano during the tour, and they actually had to wait a few months before they could fire Paul, because they already found their guy from the band Samson, Bruce the Air Raid Siren Dickinson. So Bruce would end up taking the job as the vocalist of Iron Maiden, and would be the vocalist going forward, minus a certain period in the 90s that we'll get into. But yeah, Bruce Dickinson becomes the vocal mastermind for Iron Maiden, and we are getting very close to classic Iron Maiden lineup, pretty close. So they would return to the studio, once again with Martin Birch, and released in 1982, we get an all-time legendary album, Number of the Beast. This is my number 2 album. This is one of the greatest albums ever created. And of course, the album cover, source of controversy during this time with the devil on the cover, but Eddie, the mascot, using the devil as a puppet, essentially. And yeah, all the conservative religious people were super offended by this, even though the band flat out said nothing about this album is about the devil. It's total misunderstanding, and every single time, like say, the PMRC does shit like this, it only helps to make the bands more popular. So, to the people who are upset, thank you for plugging Iron Maiden and helping them sell more albums, and become a bigger household name. Keep doing what you do, people. But yeah, I mean, the album top to bottom, it's an all-time classic. I don't really think I need to go into it too much. I mean, opening up with a fast-paced ripper with Invaders. But you also get, of course, the big hits, Run to the Hills, the title track, Number of the Beast. But you do get a few deep cuts on here, like 22 Acacia Avenue and The Prisoner. I think The Prisoner is one of the best Maiden songs of the 80s. And, of course, Adrian Smith had a hand in songwriting with that. Children of the Damned, a wonderful song. But, of course, the mighty Hallowed Be Thy Name, which I will still say is the greatest metal song ever created. Bar none. That song, brilliantly put together, wonderful melodies, great riff work, tasty licks, awesome drums, the ending vocals with Bruce. Oh, it's just, mwah! Chef's kiss. Absolute perfection. This album, while it's my number 2 favorite overall for Maiden, this is still like one of the top 10 to 20 greatest metal albums of all time. Whenever you're talking about great metal albums, this album has to be brought up. And it is my number 2. So, not long after Number of the Beast came out, Clive Burr would end up departing the band and would be replaced by Nico McBrain. So now we have reached peak Iron Maiden lineup right here with Bruce, Steve, Dave, Adrian, and Nico come together, and we begin to get into some real magic. 1 year after the Number of the Beast, and once again Martin Birch producing, and in 1983 we get the release of Peace of Mind. This is my number 5 album. Great follow-up to Number of the Beast. Just not quite as good as Number of the Beast, but very few albums are. But Peace of Mind, absolute classic album. Of course, everybody knows The Trooper from this album. That's one of the best Maiden songs of all time. The classic galloping riff and bass line and just the overall rhythm and vibe of it. But you also do get some other classics like Flight of Icarus, To Tame a Land, Still Life. Maybe my personal favorite off of this album would be the opening track, Where Eagles Dare. Arguably the best opening song in the entire Iron Maiden discography, I will say, because that song's just full of energy, full of riffs, full of vocals, full of everything that you love about Iron Maiden. And right out of the gate with that opening drum intro, Nico makes his presence felt big time. And while I do love Clive Burr and he had a great pocket style to him, Nico was a big upgrade because he can do a lot more. And in fact, the things he can do 1 foot on a kick drum is absolutely insane. And it all starts right here. So Peace of Mind, my number 5. Now originally they actually wanted to call this album Food for Thought, where they were going to have an album cover of Eddie's brains being picked off by people at our dinner table. But they probably thought, well, the last album cover got people pissed. Maybe this will get them even more pissed. So they changed it to Peace of Mind, and we got the insane Eddie in the nut house. But yeah, Peace of Mind, my number 5. So, once again, more touring, as this band is renowned for their touring schedule, and everywhere that they go to, it's absolutely incredible. So more touring, but then not long after the tour would return to the studio, and who they go to? Martin Birch. And then released in 1984, we get Power Slave. This is my number 1 album. I say this is the Maiden album of Maiden albums, because production got a little bit better on this album, little more polished, but still got grit to it. And of course, maybe the best album cover in Iron Maiden history, with the ancient Egyptian vibes to it, which is really cool. And of course, the songs, absolute classics. Ace is High, 2 Minutes to Midnight, the title track, Power Slave, Flash of the Blade, The Duelists, just Back in the Village, so many. And then, of course, the closer, maybe next to Hallowed Be Thy Name for the best closing song in Iron Maiden's discography, Rime of the Ancient Mariner. Up to this point, the longest song they ever did, at over 13 minutes and some change. And just everything about it, masterpiece. Absolute masterpiece. And of course, the whole album is a masterpiece. Now, if you were to ask me, where would this rank among the 5 greatest metal albums of all time? Hands down, top 3. No question, I would say. But yeah, Power Slave, my number 1. Don't need to go into too much detail because it's fucking Power Slave. So, then they would go out on the World Slavery Tour, and in fact, during the World Slavery Tour, they recorded the Live After Death live album, which is one of the best metal live albums of all time. But we're not including that, we're talking just studio albums. And after the World Slavery Tour was over, we now get back to the studio with Martin Birch, and released in 1986, we get Somewhere in Time. This is my number 6 album. Worthy follow-up to Power Slave, a lot different, whereas like Power Slave felt like something you would have heard around that 82 to 84 period. Here with Somewhere in Time definitely feels like something that would come out in the mid-80s, so this is where they begin to dabble with keyboards and synths, and it would be used sparingly on this album, but it would be kind of a hint of where they would go on the next album at least. But also clever album cover with like references to songs and other things with like the city and such. But yeah, this album, wonderful, of course. Wasted Years was the big hit off of here, and it's one of the catchiest Maiden songs of all time, but it's fucking fantastic songwriting. Stranger in a Strange Land, where you really get some of them synths, and it works to perfection. That's a nice, like, groovy track as opposed to, like, a sped-up gallop. This is a more groove-laden song, which was really sweet. And then, of course, the epic closer. Again, a lot of the closing songs for Iron Maiden are going to be epic, but this in particular, Alexander the Great, which, as of recording of this video, they finally are finally allowed to play that song live after so long of not being allowed to play it. So, yeah, Alexander the Great, such an epic journey of a song. through an epic journey of an album. But yeah, Somewhere in Time, great stuff right here, number 6. So after Somewhere in Time, again, more touring goes on for the band, and then they would, of course, go back to the studio once again with Martin Birch to work on their next one, and this next one would be a lot different than everything they have done before. They wanted to incorporate more progressive influence. After all, I brought up that they were really into bands like Genesis and Yes and Jethro Tull, so they kind of wanted to take that side and mix it with their signature epic, catchy, anthemic songwriting. And released in 1988, we get Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. This is my number 3 album. For a long time, I had this at number 2, but it fell to number 3. But it's still, I would say in terms of songwriting, one of the best albums for Maiden when it came down to just pure song construction. After all, bringing in those prog influences and with more of the keyboards and synths really enhance the epic qualities of Maiden right here. Opening up with Moonchild, which is a ripper of an opener. Then you get into songs like Infinite Dreams, which has some beautiful clean melodies, epic leads. You also get into Can I Play With Madness, which might be a bit over the top, but it's still a fun song. And then, of course, The Evil That Men Do is such an epic anthemic tune. Living on the Razor's Edge. And then the title track, while maybe not as epic as Rime of the Ancient Mariner, has its own unique charm to it, which I really liked. The Prophecy with that beautiful acoustic ending. The Clairvoyant, Only the Good Die Young, top to bottom, masterpiece. And you can make an argument this was a prog metal album. You could make that case because the songwriting got more lavish, the production got a little more polished, but it still retains the identity of Iron Maiden. So if you were to classify this as a prog metal album, this would be one of the best prog metal albums you could hear. That is if you would consider it to be prog metal. You could make a case, I could see arguments against it, but for me, I'm kind of in between. Like, there's more prog influence going on here, but I don't know if it's 100% prog metal. But still, fantastic album, number 3. Now, after Seventh Son of a Seventh Son, we get into a big transformation. Adrian Smith would end up leaving the band before the recording of the next album, so it kind of left the band in a bit of a bind, so they would pick up Yannick Gears, who was actually already a guitarist for Bruce Dickinson's solo band at this point, so he would come in to fill in Adrian Smith's shoes. Although Yannick's definitely closer to a Dave Murray style guitarist, so basically you had two guitarists playing the same style for a little bit. Not that that's a bad thing. Dave, hell of a player himself. Yannick's great. But it definitely goes to show you that Adrian not being there was very prominent. So we move on to 1990, back again with Martin Birch, and we would get the release of No Prayer for the Dying. This is my number 16 album, second to last. Yeah, talk about a massive drop in quality. Yeah, this is often seen as the worst of the early Bruce era. And while it's not as great as the albums we've talked about already, I don't think it's a bad album. I think it's still decent to good. There's still some really fucking great tracks on here, like Holy Smoke, the title track, Run Silent, Run Deep, and Mother Russia. Like, I think those are some great songs. But then you get into stuff like Bring Your Daughter to the Slaughter. Like, you would be hammer smashed if you played a drinking game to that song. Like, holy crap. So yeah, you got some stinkers on here, but you got some great ones on here too, so consider it a net even. It's still a decent album. It's still good, but in comparison to most of the catalog, just does not hold up. And of course, like I said, without Adrian Smith being there to help kind of right the sinking ship when it came to songwriting, definitely affected this album quite a bit, I would say. But yeah, No Prayer for the Dying, not bad, still good, but it's my number 16. So, after that, again, more tours go on for the band, and then back to the studio, and now we reach the final album with Martin Birch as the producer. And in 1992, we would get the release of Fear of the Dark. This is my number 15 album, so it's definitely an improvement on No Prayer for the Dying, but not by much, I would say. Like, you got more memorable cuts on here, like The Fugitive was a really good song. Be Quick or Be Dead, that's a ripper of a song. And even From Here to Eternity is a fun, catchy song that they got a music video for. And then, of course, the title track. The title track is one of the best Maiden songs of all time. And also forgot to mention Wasting Love, where they were trying to go for a power ballad, and I thought it was a pretty good one, I will say. But yeah, you do have some songs on here that just feel like filler. Although the song Fear is the Key is particularly an interesting one in terms of the lyrics, because it was written in honor of Freddie Mercury of Queen, as Maiden was very good friends with Freddie, and it was about the whole AIDS epidemic at the time. But yeah, it's like the songs, like the great songs, stood out so much more, in my opinion, than No Prayer for the Dying. But the fillers definitely dragged this album down. So, but yeah, like the main tracks to check out on here, of course, Be Quick or Be Dead, Wasting Love, From Here to Eternity, The Fugitive, and the title track. Other than those songs, the rest of the songs, not quite as good. They're not bad, but definitely could have benefited from more fine-tuning in the songwriting, per se. But I still think this is a pretty good album, and also, people who put this album among the worst metal albums of all time, it's like, yeah, it's not the best Maiden album, but it's definitely not a slouch. It's a lot better than a lot of people give it credit for. But yeah, my number 15, though. So now, after Fear of the Dark, we get to another big radical transformation. Bruce Dickinson would end up leaving the band, and in walks Blaze Bayley. Now, Blaze Bayley, I will give him credit. He's a pretty solid singer, but when it comes down to Iron Maiden, it's so hard to follow the footsteps of the air raid siren Bruce. It's so difficult. So we get into a couple of albums now with Blaze Bayley at the helm of the vocals. So they take a little bit of a break from doing a whole lot. They were still touring. In fact, they actually did a tour, I believe, in '93. I think this may have been before Blaze came into the band, where he had Metallica and Megadeth open for Maiden on some European runs, which, imagine being at that show. That had to have been a treat. So, now we get into Blaze Bayley. So they would return to the studio. No Martin Birch. I believe this and the next album was produced by Steve Harris. And released in 1995, we get The X Factor. This is my number 14. We're moving up. We're moving up a little bit. Yeah, this album actually is really good when it comes down to songwriting. Like, definitely the songwriting was much better, I would say, than Fear of the Dark and No Prayer for the Dying. Also, it's a little darker overall. Like, this album has a more darker overtone, which was written during Steve Harris's divorce, which probably inspired him to write some pissed off lyrics. But yeah, there are some really good songs on here. Particularly the one I wanted to talk about is Sign of the Cross. That song is one of the best Maiden songs. However, it's better when Bruce sings it live, like in Rock in Rio. When Bruce sings Sign of the Cross, it's one of the best Maiden songs of all time. Now, Blaze's vocal performances on this and the next album, not bad, but not great. Like, and that's no disrespect to Blaze as a singer. He is a great singer. It's just Bruce Dickinson's one of the greatest singers of all time, and it's so difficult to follow in that shadow. But yeah, X Factor, really good when it comes down to songwriting, but the vocals kind of drag the album down from being ranked just a little bit higher, but it is my number 14. So, more touring goes on, of course. Back to the studio we go a couple of years later, and then released in 1998, we get Virtual 11. This is my last place album. This is my number 17 overall. And again, it's not bad. It's a decent album, but, you know, just the songwriting did not really grab me. Though you do have some good tracks on here. Why don't I take the album out? Because apart from The Klansman, couldn't remember much about it. But like Lightning Strikes Twice, The Angel and the Gambler, Future Real. Like the first half of the album was pretty solid. It was actually kind of showing potential. It could have surpassed the X Factor. But then after that, it falls off big time. So it's like the first 4 tracks definitely should check out, but the rest, not so much. Like the first half strong, second half kind of ended on a whimper. And that's why the album ranks at number 17 for me. So, about a year after Virtual 11 was released, Blaze Bayley's gone from the band, and we get 2 returning members. Bruce Dickinson and Adrian Smith return. Now, this would kind of begin an interesting, unique thing with Maiden, because Adrian's back, but they were thinking, well, what do we do about Yannick? Do we get rid of him? They decided not to do that. Instead, Yannick stays, and now we got 3 guitarists in Maiden to just melt your face off with riffs and leads and harmonies and melodies, which created something unique for Iron Maiden, the fact that we got 3 guitarists in Iron Maiden. They would go back to the studio and would now begin another long-standing relationship that continues to this day with Kevin Shirley. And then released in 2000, we get Brave New World. This is my number 7 album. Welcome back. Oh, welcome back, Maiden. After pretty much all of the 90s was like lots of peaks and valleys throughout the 90s. And now we're at 2000. Bruce and Adrian's back. We have a 6-piece lineup now. And holy shit, one of the best comeback albums of all time. Now, I did have to struggle with thinking, do I like it because of the songs, or do I like it because it's not like the other stuff of the 90s? And I would say it's about 90% great songs, 10% it's just not the 90s stuff. But yeah, you have some fantastic songs on here, and again, I have to pull out the CD because apart from, I would say, Blood Brothers, the title track, The Wicker Man, I couldn't remember the song titles, so let's see, The Mercenary, great track, and then actually the final 4 songs really kind of end this album off on a more epic note. Fallen Angel, The Nomad, Out of the Silent Planet, and The Thin Line Between Love and Hate. Just brilliance all around when it comes down to this album, because, and yeah, the production, yeah, a little bit more polished, for sure. After all, Kevin Shirley is known for doing polished productions. But yeah, Brave New World, like I said, amazing comeback, great songs, and it's also just not the 90s material. But it's just glad to hear classic Iron Maiden once again, and with an added extra spice and seasoning with Yannick being in the band still and having 3 players. So yeah, my number 7. Fantastic. So, not long after Brave New World was released, more touring goes on, and they would tour for quite a while on this album before returning to the studio, and in 2003, once again with Kevin Shirley, we get the release of Dance of Death. Dance of Death is my number 9 album. It's a worthy follow-up to Brave New World. Now, I will say, Definitely the worst album cover in the entire Maiden discography. The whole CGI characters and such. I don't know why. It's just like around this period, some album covers were just not great. 2003, shit happens. But despite the bad album cover, the songs are fantastic. Rainmaker, the title track with those like really cool licks on the guitars that show up. Passchendaele, I love that like opening tap on the guitars. Journeyman, which actually was like a nice acoustic ballad to close the album, I thought it was a perfectly appropriate closing song for this album. But yeah, pretty much when it comes down to songwriting, it's like on par with Brave New World, and production's pretty similar. But it just falls a couple spots because there's one other album from the 2000s I think was just a little bit better. But Dance of Death, great album in its own right, my number 9. So, after Dance of Death, again, more touring goes on, and then in 2005, they would actually do Ozfest, where they would run into some controversy with one Sharon Osbourne. She basically did not like what Bruce had to say about her and all this and that. So she decides to hire a bunch of kids to throw eggs on the stage at a show. I can't remember the city, but at a show during Ozfest, Sharon would hire a bunch of kids to throw eggs at Iron Maiden, and Bruce going on a long rant about it. So, yeah, basically, Iron Maiden and Sharon Osbourne, not the best of friends, to put it lightly. So, yeah. But after all that happened, and more touring, the band would return to the studio once again with Kevin Shirley, and released in 2006, we get A Matter of Life and Death. This is my number 8. I think this was a little bit better than Dance of Death, but I think in terms of like what you could argue the heaviest Maiden album, this might be in the conversation for the heaviest Maiden album because it was unmastered. It was just produced and mixed. No mastering done to it, which gave it this extra layer of heaviness to it. This, like, Different World, the opening track, really is a great pace setter for this album. These colors don't run, Brighter Than 1,000 Suns. The reincarnation of Benjamin Brieg, I think, was like the big standout on this album in terms of like a quote-unquote hit, as there was some catchy riffs on there and some nice vocals. But also, For the Greater Good of God is another absolutely brilliant song, and it was one of the two big epics along with the closer, The Legacy. But yeah, like I said, I would say in terms of what you could argue is the heaviest Iron Maiden album, A Matter of Life and Death, I think, could be a good contender. Hell, there's some parts of it that would make you think it sounds like a recent Judas Priest album. But yeah, Matter of Life and Death, my number 8. So, once again, more touring, and in fact, I believe it was around this time they were doing the Somewhere Back in Time tour, where they would play a lot of the old songs, like mostly Power Slave stuff, and also the Flight 666 DVD, which I still need to get, because that's a hell of a documentary and live DVD. But we would once again go back to the studio with Kevin Shirley, and released in 2010, we get The Final Frontier. This one is my number 13 album. I think it's still a really good album. There's some awesome tracks on here, like Satellite 15, The Final Frontier, El Dorado, which was a fun, catchy single, The Talisman, but the big song that I go back to the most here on Final Frontier is Where the Wild Wind Blows, or When the Wild Wind Blows. Starts off with these like wind sounds, and then into these harmonies with the clean guitars and the bass, and it feels sad and it feels dark. And while the song maintains that, it does still get epic. And this is, I think, maybe the most underrated closing song in the entire Maiden discography. Like, I think more people should appreciate When the Wild Wind Blows. But yeah, Final Frontier, hell of an album, my number 13. So again, long tour. This is going to be the first of two really long breaks when it comes down to studio output. It would be another 5 years before we would get yet another Maiden album. And for this next album, they would eventually end up leaving EMI and then join with BMG / Parlophone Records to handle the releases of Maiden going forward. And for this next album, they were going to go really ambitious and make their first double album, studio album, I should say, their first studio double album, and really go long with it too. And released in 2015, we get The Book of Souls. This is my number 12 album. I still think this is a great album, all things considered. You got some amazing songs on here. Speed of Light, which was the big single, felt like a single, but it was fun and catchy, and it was kind of a ripper. The Red and the Black, When the River Runs Deep, awesome tracks. Death or Glory is another big ripper, I would say. Tears of a Clown, kind of like Fear is the Key. In this case, this was a loving tribute to the late, great Robin Williams. But then you get to the big epic closer, Empire of the Clouds. 18 minutes of just brilliance and beauty and just Iron Maiden at the top of their game right here. But yeah, really my main reason why I have it at number 12, aside from it being pretty long, it just doesn't hold up compared to other albums. But still, top to bottom, it was a great double album, all things considered. My number 12. But now we get into the longest break in the entire discography. So again, more touring going on for Maiden for the next few years. And then they actually went into the studio and actually had this album recorded in 2019, but then the pandemic hit, so they decided to shelve it for a while. And then when it was around the time shows were starting to come back towards the summer of 2021, then they decided to release it finally. So the longest gap, 6 years after Book of Souls, 2021, we get the release of Senjutsu. I actually reviewed this album when it came out, so if you want to know my full opinion, you can check out my review. But this is my number 11. I think it was an improvement over Book of Souls, simply put, not as long as as the Book of Souls, but you still get some awesome tracks on here, like the title track, Riding on the Wall, Stratego was particularly fun, Days of Future Past was a hell of a mysterious yet catchy tune. But for me, again, the big standout on here, the closer of Disc 2, Hell on Earth. I would say one of the best modern closing songs for Iron Maiden, all things considered. And really, like I said in the review, the only complaints I had was that there were a couple of songs, especially in Disc 2, where they would hang on certain riffs for just way too long. And that was really the one thing that kind of took me out of it. But still, I'd say it was a little bit better than Book of Souls, and I think it's still a great album, all things considered, once again. And it is my number 11. But anyways, that does it for the Iron Maiden discography ranking. So I actually kind of had a bit of an easier time ranking this than I did with Immolation, that's for damn sure. But still, had to make some choices, especially with the 2000s catalog. Because honestly, those three albums I could interchange, because they're all great in their own right. But yeah, feels good to finally get Maiden out of the way when it comes down to discography rankings. And as far as what's going to be coming up, well, first, what did you guys think of my Maiden ranking? Let me know in the comments below, what is your favorite Iron Maiden album? Now, as far as who's going to be the next band I'm going to cover, that will be in around early August. I am going to be covering Anthrax. It's time I get the final band of the Big Four out of the way, and then after Anthrax, we'll have 3 more rankings coming up. And those will be coming out in the fall, heading into winter, so I would say around mid-September is going to be when I'm going to be covering Enslaved. Then, late October, I'm going to be covering the mighty Judas Priest. And then, around holiday season, I'm going to be covering Edge of Sanity. So, got a busy schedule ahead of me for the rest of the year when it comes to discography rankings. But anyways, thank you guys for watching the Maiden ranking, and until next time, keep your horns high and your dreams wet.